Hi there everybody, my name's Kerry Newell. I'm a wildlife artist based in Cheshire here in the UK, and I've been invited by Derwent and Cult Pens to create a little workshop for you all. Now, as some of you may know, it was supposed to have been an actual live stream last week, but something happened with the internet and it cut out, so I've agreed to record a little project for you. I'm assuming you've already signed up and you've got the line work and the reference image and everything you need to get going. So I'm just going to switch off this camera that's looking at me and we'll go straight to the overhead camera so you're not put off by me on the screen and you'll be able to see more of the screen that's actually pointing downwards. Okay, so I'll just turn that off now and then we'll nip over to the downward camera. Okay, that's better. So Derwent kindly sent me a couple of sets of the 24 pans and a set of the 12. We'll be using a limited palette out of the 24 set, but use what you have and we'll see how we go. So first of all, I'm just going to talk through a few of the materials we'll be using today and then we'll get on to the actual project itself. So I'll move those out of the way. Derwent actually sent me some of the paints before they were actually released, so I got to have a play with them and do some projects with them, which was wonderful. So the two papers we're going to be looking at today is the Derwent watercolour paper. That is very smooth, so I'm classing that as a hot press paper. It's very white, very bright white, very smooth. The other one is the Derwent Inktense paper, and it's quite textured, so I'm classing that as a cold press paper, and as you can see, compared to this one, it's more of a creamy tone. I hope the camera's picking that up for you. And it's this paper, the Inktense paper, that I'll be using for the project today. So that's the two papers. Let's get those out of the way. So what I have done is I've taped a little bit of the Derwent Inktense paper there, which is classed as the cold press, and the hot press paper there. And we're just going to take a quick look at the Technique brushes that have been released by Derwent. So we've got a few to look at and we'll have a quick play with some paints. Now what I do is I pre-wet them, so we'll give them a quick spritz. This is the 12 set we'll be looking at the minute, and I'll just do some samples with these brushes from the 12 set. Now what I do recommend is when you are preparing to do a project, it's nice to make a swatch sheet on the paper that you're actually going to be using for the project, because paints look different, especially watercolour paints, depending on what colour paper you're using, whether it's a bright white, off-white, cream or even tan. So I know some people like to work on black watercolour paper as well, but I haven't done that. So what I've made, I've taken a piece of the Derwent Inktense paper, and for the 12 set and the 24 set, I've just made a little swatch card, and I've made it so it actually fits in here as well. So with the two sets, let me show you, you get a really nice big mixing area with both sets, so plenty of room to mix your paints. You also get a water brush with each set, and what a water brush is, there's a little barrel on the end. You fill that up with water, screw it back in, and then when you take the lid off, all you have to do is squeeze the barrel of the brush and the water comes through the bristles at the end. Now today, for those of you that have got water brushes, feel free to use those. For those that haven't, just use a normal brush. But what I'm going to do for today is, if you're not used to water brushes like this, it's best just to get used to the bristles first by just dipping them in a pot of water and using them as you would a normal brush. Once you're used to the water brush being used that way, then you can start squeezing the barrel, letting the water run down and using it that way. Okay, so that's what I'll be using today. I'll be dipping it into the water pots instead of squeezing the barrel. Okay, but let's just talk quickly through these technique brushes that that Derwent have sent to me. Oh, you'll have to forgive me, this is all oh dear. Right, okay, so the first one is the foam brush. So it's a piece of foam attached to a handle, has Derwent written on there. There's a couple of ways you can use this. You can either apply water to your paper and then add paint pigment to that, or you can actually add paint pigment to it directly. So let's do that. Let's get the brush nice and wet to begin with, just dipping it in some clean water, squeezing out the excess, and then we'll go into one of the paints. And by doing that, you can just apply it straight to the paper, dip in a bit more, and that way you can get a nice clean wash across quite a large area. And if you keep moving your pigment, you won't end up with any hard lines. Okay, so that's the foam brush, can be used for applying paint or pigment, and it's really easy to blend. You can cover such a large area in a small amount of time with this. It's really nice. So when you're painting a large area, where it stops here will be called a found edge. So it's where the water and pigment has found dry paper, and it's here that there'll be a hard edge when it's dry. But if I apply pigment to the middle of this area, because the paper's still wet, it'll dry with a softer edge, and that is called a lost edge. So if you hear artists talking about lost and found edges, that is all that means. Okay, so I'm going to clean off this foam brush quickly because I don't want you all waiting and wasting your time watching paint dry. Pop that over there. Now the next one into the bunch is the sword liner. So I'll dip it in clean water so you can see the shape, and as the descriptive name says, it's straight along one edge and then it's curved up the other, and that's the sword liner. And this is used a lot of the time by botanical artists and people like that, and you can get quite an array of techniques just with this one brush. But again, use what you have. So you can go in like it's more or less like a calligraphy style edge. You can get details by just using, this is actually hitting the surface of the paper, so it's creating a little bit of texture. But you can use the edge, as I was going to say, to create quite fine details with this brush. So it's whatever your imagination can conjure up, that's what you're going to be able to achieve. So you can use the very edge, and then by tipping the brush up onto the tip, you can actually get some really fine dots and details as well. But obviously the longer the bristles, the less control you may have over a brush until you're used to it. So again, let's dip that in there, get a little bit of pigment, and if you can see that it's picking up the texture. Now when it picks up the texture, that's called dry brushing, and it just leaves areas where the paint isn't reaching the paper, so it's hitting the hills and missing the valleys. And you can get really nice effects for the surface of water and things like that, where you'd need a more textured finish to your painting. Obviously on the hot press paper, the paper is smooth, less texture, and so less overall texture when you're laying down a wash. And even if I was to do dry brush on here on the hot press paper, it still wouldn't look as textured as when you go onto the rough surface of the cold press paper. That's the sword liner. The next one we'll just have a quick look at is the fan brush. So the fan brush looks like that. Just hold that up to the camera a little bit better. And as you can see, it just looks like a fan. But when you dip it in water, so into clean water, some of the bristles clump together. It's probably better if I hold it over the paper. So these little individual spikes, it looks like. And it's best to mix up in your mixing wells if you want to get a lot of pigment on there, because obviously the brush is wider than the little pans that the paint is in. These paints by Derwent are really smooth when they're dry. Very, very good light fastness throughout the range. And very smooth application as well. So with this brush, you can use it that way. So you can create quite a bit of pigment release. So the harder you press down with the brush, the further up the barrel, or the further up the bristle line, so the more pigment is here. So if you want to get fine details, go this way and flick. So nice for doing grasses, things like that. You can also do fur if you're working on a bigger project, but for this brush, I wouldn't work with fur anything too small because of the splay of the bristles. So again, just flicking up. But as I said earlier, your imagination can go wild with these brushes, and you'd be able to create so much just by playing with the brushes. And obviously I'm not going to cover a lot of detail because I know you're probably itching to get onto the actual project in hand. The next one is the comb brush. So this one can be used on a smaller project. It can create this kind of effect. It can create this kind of effect too. So let's go into a different colour. I'm going to some blue and I will show you. So again, flicking up. And we'll go over onto the side as well, onto the hot press paper. And again, the harder you push, the wider the lines are going to be. So if I push down, wider lines, and you're hitting this part of the brush as well, the harder you push, so more pigment will be placed onto your paper. Do that on the hot press. And press down. But I don't know if you can see, but here where it's skipping on the textured paper, that would be lovely for doing the surface of water, because in some areas where you look out at water, it does look quite condensed, but then you get the sunlight hitting the surface, and that could be where the paint pigment breaks and the surface of the textured paper shows through. But also with a brush like this, you can still tip it and just use the very tips to create single lines, fine lines, even dots. So a fine line and dots. But as I said, if you've got these and you want to learn more about them, the best thing is just to play with them. Get a piece of scrap paper, as I have here, tape it down, or you don't even have to tape it down if you don't want to, but I do to stop it cockling. Tape it down and just play with your materials. So the next one is the flat, which is just a flat brush. These are all golden tacklon, which is nylon bristles. And you can do things like this, things like this. All of these things can be done with this brush. Another thing you can do with this brush though is by double loading. So you can pop one colour on one corner, one colour on the other corner. Let's go over here first. And then when you apply the paint, you have two pigments that can then blend together. So let's do that again. So a little bit more water on there. So the red onto one corner. Obviously if you're doing red and blue, you'd make a purple in the middle, orange on the other corner, and let's go across. Lovely. Let's just do it up here. So we're running out of pigment on here, so we might get some dry brush effect, and there you go. So that's the flat brush, and I'm sure if you've been painting a while, you probably already have a flat brush in your stash that you can have a play with. The last one in the techniques brushes is the rigger. So it doesn't look very neat when it's dry. Dip it in water and forms a beautiful fine point. So these were named rigger brushes, I believe, because they were originally used in nautical paintings, marine paintings, where the artist would be using brushes like this to paint the riggings on ships, so the long ropes and things like that. Now if you want to load up a brush like this, it's best to twirl it into the paint, and by doing that you're filling all of that belly of the brush with pigment and water, and these can go on and on for a long time. So just by dipping it once in paint, you really do get a lot of miles out of that amount of pigment. And you can do some fine detail as well. Just remember the bristles are long, so having control over them can be a little bit more difficult if you're not used to having such long bristles on a fine brush. But if you want to do a long line, or you don't want to have to keep dipping your brush into the paint, then this is probably the detailing brush for you at some point during your painting journey. So it's running out of pigment now, and it's hitting the hills and valleys. Well, it's hitting the hills, missing the valleys, so it's looking quite textured there. So they are the techniques brushes, and I will be picking a couple of them up through the project, so feel free to use yours if you have them. If not, use what you already have. So we'll move this out of the way now, and let's have a look at the project we're going to be doing. So I'll move those out of the way as well. So the project, today's project. So painted lady butterfly on a flower. So nice, oh sorry, not a painted lady, monarch butterfly on a flower. I'm saying that because I've just finished a painted lady in gouache, so yeah, this is a monarch butterfly on a flower. It's very stylized, it's very simple. And what we're going to cover today, we're going to see how to do a nice out of focus background, which is really simple, putting the base coat and then top coats onto the butterfly, wetting wet washes for this part of the flower. We'll do a few petals today because all the petals are worked the same, so I'll just do a few of them today. And the stalk would just be the same as doing a petal, but just with different colours. And then you'll be able to finish the painting off at home when you have time. We'll see how far we get today. Okay, so I'm going to move this out of the way. I'm not going to be working from a reference image today. I'm just going to be looking at this painting that's already been completed. So we'll move that out of the way. Now then, oh, I know what I will do actually while I have this out. So I also worked with a limited palette. And I know a lot of beginners, when they get a set like this, it's got 24 colours, the temptation is to use every single colour in the palette. But the trouble is, by doing that, it can be very confusing for a starter because you don't know which ones you've picked up and put where. You can lose track quite quickly. Another thing, if you use less colours, the finished painting will look more harmonious, and that's what I wanted to go for on here. So what I've done, I made a little swatch just of the paints that I used in this one painting. So there's only 6 colours used out of the set: magenta, dark violet, orange, deep cadmium, bottle green and Payne's grey. So no black, used in there. I think black, if we'd have used black on the butterfly, it just would have looked too harsh. So I went with the Payne's Grey, which has a blue undertone. So what I did on another palette of 24 that Derwent sent me, I know I'm very lucky, aren't I, to have been sent all these wonderful paints. Because these can be lifted out, the single pans can be lifted out and replaced, so they're all open stock. So if you run out of your favourite, you could just replace that one. And also, each section of 6, that section can be lifted out with this little bit here and here, there and there. So 6 can be lifted out, or single ones can be lifted out. And what I did, I got these 6 colours out of this set and I put them here. So I know I'm only using these 6 colours whilst working on the project for you. I've turned it upside down so that I have mixing palette right next to me and the paints above me. Some people like to work like that, but I don't want to keep leaning, as it were, over my paints. I'd rather have it this way. Okay, so I'm going to move that out of the way. I'm going to move that out of the way so we don't make a mess. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to wet these paints. So pre-wetting them with the Derwent spritzer with some deionized water in there, so there's no impurities in the water. So pre-wetting them just activates the surface of the paint, makes it a little bit easier to work with. Some paints require it, some don't, but I've found it just works really nicely with the new Derwent pans. And then you'll need some, well, I'll need some kitchen roll, some tissues. So I always hold a tissue in my hand in case I get paint where I don't want it, I can quickly dab it out. And some kitchen roll at hand if I need to dry off brushes and things like that. One more thing about the Derwent paints is something you might want to do with your water soluble products is make a larger swatch sheet. This way you can test opacity and lifting properties and glazing, things like that. So I just, with this piece, this is also the Inktense paper, so this is the cold press, and just sectioned off 24 sections on a sheet of paper. Then I used a black Sharpie pen. Sharpie pens are permanent, so they won't shift once water's been added on top. Just made these lines, black lines straight across. Then the mass tone is the colour at which the paint comes straight out of the pan. So paint the mass tone at the top, using clean water, bring it down, and it shows you how light it goes, how transparent it can go from the top. Wait for that to dry, wait for that layer to dry, then put a second mass tone coat down the left hand side, which is classed as a glaze, because a glaze is simply one colour going over another. I'll talk about that more when we do the project. Then once that's dry, I go in with a clean damp brush and just see if the paint will lift. So you get a brush in one hand, go over the corner with water, clean water, and just dab the pigment off. And if you can see all of the paper, then it's an easy lifting colour. If you can see some of the colour that's left, then it's more likely to be a staining colour. And going forward through your painting journey, you'll realise what colours you'd like to use in a painting. If you know you're going to be lifting colours, you'll be choosing colours that lift more easily and things like that. But once all this is dry, you can then see how opaque or how transparent a paint is by how much of the black line shows through. So if a lot of the black line shows through, they're transparent. If not much of the black line shows through, they're more of an opaque colour. Harder to tell with the black, obviously, because it's black on top of a black line. But the white, this is actually painted with the white paint just here. I can see that it is covering up some of the black line. So I know that if I mix my white paint quite thickly to put the spots on at the end on the butterfly. I know as long as I mix the white, nice and thick consistency, it will be opaque enough to cover anything underneath. Okay, so that's another. So 2 types of swatch. Just a simple swatch of colour to keep with your palette, and a swatch sheet that shows you a few more things about each paint colour and what they do or what they don't do. Different properties for different colours. But throughout the whole range of the 24 colours, they're all highly light fast pigments. They're all available open stock. All of the colours I was able to glaze with. There's not a lot of shift in colour when they dry. Don't forget, when you're working with watercolour paints, they can dry between 15 to 25% lighter, depending on how much water you've used. And I was really, really happy. The application of the paint is very smooth, and they all dry with a matte finish. So if you're looking to create a painting and make prints from it, or photograph it, your paintings to go on to send to friends or to go on to social media and things like that, they all photograph really well because of the matte finish. And obviously the palettes are portable, and because they come with a water brush, they'll be ideal for taking on holiday, plein air painting, things like that. So portable in size. You've got your mixing palette and you've got your brush. There's not a lot more you'd need if you wanted just to go out and sketch and paint plein air. That takes some saying. Okay, let's get down to painting, shall we? So I'm going to move the other 2 palettes out of the way now. We'll be working with a limited palette, just 6 colours. And the reason these colours work really well is because they are analogous. So I chose a palette of colours that are next to each other on a colour wheel. Now, if they're next to each other on a colour wheel, they're going to look nice and harmonious in a painting. And you can also use colours that are opposite on a colour wheel. They're known as complementary colours, and they also look very nice next to each other on a painting too. So, colour wheel, something every artist should have. Okay, let's get on with some painting. So here we have a sketched out image. I have made the lines quite dark on this. The simple reason is I want you to be able to see the lines, but if they'd be too dark for you on your painting, then just go over the lines a little bit with a putty rubber. A rubber that won't damage the surface of the paper, and then we're good to go. So first things first, I'm going to pick up a flat brush to begin with, and we're going to mix up a little bit of colour that we're going to want in the outer focus background. So working from these 6 colours. So some clean water straight onto the mixing area. I'm going to pick up a little bit of that one, put it over in that corner, rinse my brush, and I will pick up a little bit of the orange as well, pop it in this corner. So because we want the background to be out of focus and quite light in colour, I don't want to add too much pigment at this point. I'm going to swizzle this round just so I can get to all areas comfortably. Grab a tissue in one hand, and with just clean water apply a little bit of water to the paper. Spread it evenly out, and what I'm doing now is I'm just sort of putting my head on one side, and I can see the shine of where the paper is wet. And while it's damp like that, we're just going to add a little bit of pigment and just let it do its thing on the paper. Now I'm not going right to the edge of where I've wetted, else I will get hard edges, and we don't want hard edges, we want soft edges. It looks quite bold at the minute, but it will dry lighter. So just a little bit of colour down there, letting them just mix and do their thing. Best thing about watercolour, let it just mix and do its own thing. I'm not taking it right up to the butterfly, although you can if you want to. A little bit of water. If you add water, it will run back into the paint and it can create little blooms. Some artists call them cauliflowers, some artists call them blooms, but it's actually just a water bloom. It's where the water goes back into the pigment. And we'll just do the same around this area, and then we'll just let the paper dry naturally. I do have a hairdryer to one side if we need to speed things up, but we don't want to take too long doing this because I know time is precious for everybody, and it's sort of a rinse and repeat doing this. I'm leaning back again. Now you could be using that foam brush to apply this water if you wanted to get more water onto the paper in a quicker time. Let's just add some pigment again. You can go over the antenna of the butterfly because we're going to be going over that anyway. A little bit more pigment. Pop a little bit of the orange in. Just be careful with some of your stronger pigments. They might want to take over the painting a little bit. A little bit more water on there. Let's see if we can get some different effects on this part. If you want to spritz the back of your paper, you can, but you might get water going where you don't want it to go. So again, a little bit more. I think what I will do, I'm going to soften this area a little bit. I'm going to add a little bit of water, and you may see some blooms. Things like this can be quite hit and miss with watercolour, and when it boils down to it, just enjoy the process and learn from each painting. So just softening the edges there. If you have too much water, you can go in with a tissue and just pick some out. So that's why it's always nice to have tissue in one hand. Okay, and we'll just soften that edge a little bit. Maybe a little bit more water here. The more water you add, the lighter the pigment will dry. So don't panic. If it's looking too dark, just add some water to the paper, and the pigments will dry that little bit lighter for you. Just going to pull a little bit of pigment up to the back of the wing there, because I felt like there was a little bit of a line running around there where the pigment wasn't moving. And we were still working, the paper's still damp, so it's fine. There you go. Hope everybody's keeping well and staying creative. There you go. So we'll leave the background to dry now. So clean off my brush, turn the paper around. So that's a nice simple background in. That will do. We want the focus to be on the butterfly and on the flower. So I've just noticed here we're getting a little bit of a hard edge that I'm not quite keen on. We'll just soften that out as well. Now at this point we've got water going right the way up to the flower, and we also have water going right the way up to the butterfly. So if we were to put paint on either the butterfly or the flower now, it would bleed out into the background. So I'm going to give it a quick blast with the hairdryer. So anybody listening with headphones on, you might want to turn them down or just take them off a minute, or one of the hosts at either Derwent or Cult Pens might edit this bit out. So I'm just going to use a hairdryer. We're going to zap the background dry, well, dryish. Okay. And we're back, and I'll just grab a quick drink so I don't lose my voice halfway through. Okay, so that paper, it's not completely dry, it's dry enough. You'll soon see when we start to add pigment, if you get any leaching out into the area that was wet, it just might need drying a little bit more, in which case you will be able to pause this video and then come back to it, you know, press start again. So grabbing a tissue again, and we're just going to put now a base coat of orange all over the butterfly, so his body as well as his wings. And I will use this brush for that. So you could use this one, but obviously when we come up to this area here and the small head, you might find it a bit tricky if you're just using a flat brush. So if you use a rounder brush, which is what this would be classed as, a round brush, you'll be able to get into the areas of the wing and the small head where you might not be able to with the flat. So let's just pull everything in a little bit more. So dipping into this orange that we've already got mixed up here, and just putting a coat of it over the wing. Might want to add a little bit more orange there because we do have some pink mixed in, but that's fine. And we're going wet on dry. So the background would be classed as wet on wet because we wetted the area first, and this is wet on dry. And we're just going to let it travel all the way down that part of the wing. So we're going over everything. Down this area of the wing. And I will add a little bit more water to the pigment here because I want the bottom wing, this part here, just to be a little bit lighter. And by adding a little bit more water, I know that this area will dry lighter than that area. So you can either do it this way, or you can do it the other way around. You can do this lighter, add more pigment, and then do the top half. It just gives the butterfly a little bit more interest when you have one area lighter than the other. So I keep dipping into my water. So I'm using this as a traditional brush, but you can squeeze the barrel and get the water to come out if you prefer that. I just think it's a nice way of people to getting used to a water brush by using it like a normal brush to begin with. And we'll just go up and over the body as well, because that's all going to be covered up later. At the minute we're getting base coat layers down, and then we're going to let them dry, and hopefully by the time we've done something to the flower we can come back and work more on the butterfly. Now as you can see, this is lighter and it's not even dry yet, so that's lighter than that, and as the two dry that will stay lighter than that because there's less pigment, more water. More pigment, less water, simple. So we'll leave that alone and let it dry. Rinse off the brush. These bristles do stain. Most brushes stain eventually, even when you're using watercolours, and it doesn't bother me at all. The palettes stain very slightly, but that doesn't worry me at all. If the palette staining bothers you, or this beading up of the colours bothers you, the more you use a palette, the less beading up of paint will occur, so that's fine. If you go over them with a magic sponge, you know, an eraser sponge that you use in kitchens and things, you will get rid of this beading effect, but it will stain more. It'll cause the plastic palette to stain more. But I suggest just keep using it. This beading up will slowly stop and you'll end up with puddles of paint instead of beads of paint. And the staining, yeah, it's a case of just getting used to a stained palette. But all plastic palettes stain. I haven't found one that doesn't. So we're going to work on this area of the flower now. I want a base coat on here. And I know I'm going to be using this colour and this colour, which are magenta and dark violet, on just this area here. So to start off with, I'm going to get my pigments ready, because you don't want to be starting an area and not have your pigments ready and having then to mix them. So that's the magenta. And then over here, we'll have the dark violet. So you only need a little bit. Don't forget, the darker the pigment, the less you need, because it'll overtake a painting if you're not careful. And this is only the first layer. If you did the butterfly base layer and it was too light, let it dry, or dry it with a hairdryer, and then put a second coat on. And that in itself is glazing. So all glazing is layering one colour over another to either intensify the existing colour or to tint and alter the look of the existing colour with whatever colour you apply on top. And you do, if you really want to get to grips with glazing, then I suggest using just the most transparent colours, because when you start to use a more opaque colour, it will simply cover up what the work and the colours that you've already applied. Okay, so we have the dark violet and we have the magenta mixed up. So what I'm going to do now is I want to cover this area in water, and also I'm going to get the rigger brush ready, because I'm going to be using that too. So some clean water and swirling it around just to cover this area of the flower down to where the actual petals start. And now I'm going to add the magenta, and I'm just going to drop it in. Can you see how it's bleeding out into the water? So you can leave little gaps if you want, or you can cover the whole thing. It's entirely up to you. If you're unsure, just have a little scrap of paper to one side to practice things on before going on to your actual project. So I'll have a little bit more magenta coming down here. And then I'm going to switch over and add a little bit of the dark violet to this area. Working wet into wet, because we've already wetted the paper. Again, in with some of this one, in with the magenta, letting them mix now, and creating a darker value at the bottom of this part of the flower than at the top, just by letting them mix. And when you start adding pigment to existing pigment, that's just called charging. So you're charging the pigments. I hope you're all getting better weather than we are at the minute. I'm just looking out the window, just glanced out the window then, and it's raining so hard here. Glad we're not doing plein air today. Okay. Rinse my brush off again, put it to one side, pick up the rigger brush, and all I'm going to do, I've dipped it in water, then just drying it off so we've got a nice fine point. and we're popping it into the pigment, and we're just going to drag some of the pigment up to create the little spikes that are running out around this part of the flower. Harder you press, the wider the line. If you feel like running out of pigment, just dip it in, because this will have already started drying, and depending on how warm your room is and how much water is actually on that part of the flower, you might need to just put a little bit of pigment on. So just flicking it up, tilting the brush up onto its tip. So I'm only using the very tip of this brush at the moment. If you see areas in this part of the painting where maybe you haven't put enough pigment, quickly pop it in while the paper's still damp. And then a little bit of the darker pigment. Mix it with some of the magenta, just to make a few little darker areas around the bottom. So I've gone out of shape a bit here, so I can correct that while everything's still damp and not end up with any hard lines where we don't want it. Now if I want this darker area to go even darker, the best thing is to get a little bit more pigment. So we've got more pigment, less water in that area of the mixing well, and just drop it in. And straight away you can see that's going darker. So keeping this area of the palette just where there's more pigment, less water. Let it bleed and do its own thing. And if I want to intensify the pigment elsewhere on this part of the flower, I can do the same with the magenta. Pick up a little bit more pigment. So more pigment, less water, and drop that in too. But don't put it all over, because you still want it to look like there is a shape there. We want sort of a domed shape to this part of the flower. Maybe a little bit of shadow in where the butterfly is sitting. And you can even bring some of that magenta down further into the purple if you wish. It's your painting. You do colours that you like. You could do this in a completely different colour palette if you wanted to. If your favourite colours are blue, or blue and purple would look nice, or yellows and oranges. So we're going to leave this alone now. We really want that paint to settle. Temptation is to keep going in, doing more, but we can come back and do more later when it's dry if we're not happy with it. So I'm going to get the hairdryer out again now, because I want to be reaching over that to do work on the butterfly. The butterfly might not be dry yet. So let's get all of this nice and dry. Don't do what I'm doing and waggle a damp brush over your painting. We're going to get all this dry now, and then we'll come back. And we're back. So what we can do now, this is more or less dry, is I'm going to turn the board round so we can get at this butterfly without reaching over all of the paper. And we're going to mix a colour that is going to be for the body and the darker areas of the butterfly wing. So we know we've got purple out already, but let's mix up some of the Payne's grey. So going into the Payne's grey just here, and I'm going to move that to a different well, just so I can keep it separate, completely separate from the purple, from the dark violet. And here I'm just going to take a little bit of scrap paper, and I'm just going to test the colours out now. So that's Payne's grey, so it's got a blue undertone. And we already know that we've put orange down. So pick up a bit of orange and put that down. So if I take a bit of Payne's grey and mix it on top of there, it goes darker, but it's still got a lovely tone to it because it's going over the orange. You'll see it as we go. Even though that orange isn't dry, I can see that it turns this from a blue tone to more of an earthy tone, which looks really lovely when painting wildlife. Okay. So a little bit more of the Payne's grey over here. Clean the brush off. Now, because we're only using one pigment, I'm okay to keep replenishing this from here. If we were using a mix of pigments, I'd want to mix up a lot more pigment, because the worst thing is to get part of the way through painting something and run out of mixed pigment. But because we're only using one, we can keep refilling it from that area. So let's take a little bit. So take a look at your reference image or the image of the finished butterfly and just have a look what needs to be dark. So we're going to fill in the head. We're going to leave these little antennas till later. We're filling in the head. Now once you have a bead of paint on the paper, just try and keep it moving if you can. Go over those little legs. Don't worry about the white spots that are on the butterfly. We'll come to those later. And if I go really quiet, it's that I'm concentrating not to get my head in the frame. So if the pigment goes lighter, as it has down that section of the wing, that's fine, because it really just adds to the whole feel of the painting. So we don't want all of this just blocked, as I was saying earlier, we don't want it just blocked in with black, because it would look really flat. There'd be no interest in it at all. And we're working wet on dry. We haven't pre-wetted this area at all. These paints work so wonderfully for layering. Don't press down too hard with your brush, because we don't want to be lifting any of that orange that's underneath. We want it to be part of the painting, building up layers. And the more layers of paint on your paper, the nicer it is, because the light gets to refract through the layers and bounce around, and it gives an added depth to a piece. So again, dipping into the pigment, and I'm working from the body area of the butterfly out towards the edges of the wing. If you go over a bit, that you didn't want to go over, it's fine. You're not going to have the reference image hanging on the wall next to your painting. Don't worry about it. It's just a simple project that we're covering today, just to get a feel for our watercolours and brushes and things, and it's just all about having fun and relaxing. If you don't feel as though the paint's going on dark enough, that's fine. We can dry this layer off and we can do a second layer, a third layer. Keep building up the layers until it looks how you want it to look. So I've deliberately gone over 2 little markings there that I don't think we actually need them in the painting. So while the areas are wet, you can apply more pigment and it will be as though you're painting wet on wet. So you won't get any hard edges. So I'll just darken down here up a little bit where I think there'd be a little bit of shadowing by the shape of the butterfly. Darkening some areas. And obviously we're going to be putting white spots on later, and if we don't have a dark enough area to put spots onto, they won't show up so much. So you do need to have a little bit of a contrast for the white dots to show up. So I'll go back in and apply a little bit more. So if you want to, you can dry yours off between layers or carry on working and just pop in a little bit more pigment on where you think it needs it. And then I will let it fade out, coming up this part of the wing where the light may be hitting the butterfly a little bit more. And we can intensify the orange later. So if the orange is looking quite washed out, we will be going in with more paint later, so don't worry about that. Because we are going to be altering the orange a little bit with yellow. We're going to be glazing a little bit of yellow into the orange of the wing later. And that's that part of the wing done. Now for the top part, I'm going to water my paint down even more because I don't want this to be too dark. So again, just popping some pigment on the paper. I'm actually leaning over on one side now, so I'm not getting in the way of the camera. So that's gone on quite dark. I want to lighten that a little bit. Don't forget, it is going to dry a little bit lighter than it's going on. If you get too much paint, you can lift it out with a tissue, which I did there. But we want this top part of the wing to be lighter than the bottom half. And you can just go backwards and forwards, working as you go to darken areas. I'm just pushing pigment round now because I do want this area of the black to be a little bit lighter. Might have to go a little bit darker than that. As I said, we're going to be adding white spots later. So let's get a little bit more pigment and just let it bleed out into these wetted areas. And it's really nice doing it this way because you won't end up with any hard edges. Just tidying up that edge there. And we'll leave that to dry. Okay, so I'm going to turn round. I'm going to turn the board round now. Okay, so let's leave that little butterfly. Oh, in actual fact, there's a bit there, I've just noticed. And I'm just going to add a little bit of pigment while it's still damp. It's not as wet as the top part of the wing, but I just missed a little bit that I noticed there. And we'll leave it to dry. So let that dry now. And if you're still working on that, obviously pause the video and then we'll move on. So we're letting this area dry. I'm happy with the flower so far. But now we want to do some petals. And it is simply a case of working your lightest tones to your darker tones. On the finished painting that I did and that I've supplied to Derwent to send to you, I've got a little bit of light coming in from this angle, and obviously this area is going to be in shade. You can do yours however you want to. If you want to follow me and keep these lighter and the underneath darker, that would be great. I also noticed that on the finished painting I've sent to Derwent, I have filled out the edge of the flower quite a lot more than I have on this. Now if you want yours to be a little bit fuller, we've still got these pigments mixed up. So take your clean brush and I'll just show you how to fill those edges out a little bit more. So you can either go into the flower or out from the flower. If you go out from the flower, you'll end up with a pointy edge to the flick. If you go into the flower, you'll end up with a bit of a stumpy edge to the point, if that makes sense. So I'll just put a few in just to fill this out a little bit more. Either way, you can fill it out or you can leave it quite sparse. So that's going in with a round brush. If you go in with your rigger, you're going to get a lighter, finer detail that can be a little bit more tricky to control until you get used to the brush. So by going in here, just working around those edges and filling some of the gaps gives a fuller effect. Don't flick too hard because you'll go onto the butterfly, and don't forget he's still damp. So work it out like that. Work some darks down there as well. Okay, let's start on the petals. So the best thing to do if you're new to painting with watercolours and things like that is just to work one petal at a time. I like to work from the back of a painting to the front of the painting, so towards the viewer. So any petals that are the furthest away from me are the ones that I want to paint first. So there's a little section there, we're going to get him painted in first. So that will be, because it's darker, I'm going to get a little bit of the magenta, tiny little bit of the purple just to darken it down. And then we're just going to paint in that small section and we're going wet on dry. And just paint that section in. And leave it to dry. Now then, the temptation is to do the one next to it, or there, or the one above it. The trouble is if we go on either of those three, that paint will run into the one where we're we're wetting. So when you're working petals, it's nice to, or feathers or anything like that, where things are sitting next to each other on a painting, you want to do alternate ones. Either that, or you paint one, dry it, and then paint the next one, and then dry it, and do it that way. But just to make it easier, try and leave gaps. And if you get to a point where you can't leave a gap, then dry it with a hairdryer or a heating tool. Just don't heat your paper too hot with a heating tool, because you don't want to scorch the paper. So we know how to do a darker area. That's quite simple. Let's do a lighter area. So we'll do this thin petal that's running up here. So to get a lighter finish, we want more water, less pigment. There's a couple of ways you can do this to go really light. If you put water on first and then apply pigment, it'll be very light in colour. So let's try that on this one. So there goes the water, and the water has got some pigment in. So if I wanted clean water, I'd have to go and change my water now. So there is some pigment in there. We're going to add a tiny bit of pigment, and we're going to let it run down that edge, and then we're just going to let it do its thing and leave it at that. It's a really simple one to do, and leave it to dry. So that one's really dark, that one's really light. How about this one, which is sort of a mid-tone? So I'm not going to pre-wet the paper, but I'm going to make sure there's quite a bit of water, because we don't want it going that dark. So pop it on. I'm going to have a shadowed area under there, and a shadowed area under there. So we want quite a bit of pigment in those two areas. Now what I'm doing, I'm putting darker areas down. I'm pulling the pigment down, but only in certain areas where I want the shadows to be. Now I'm going to clean my brush. Hear me tapping it in the water pot. Dry it off slightly, and then just let the pigment drag onto the damp brush and pull from the edges. And what will happen is it will leave pigment in the darker areas, so full pigment, but it will dilute it coming down onto the rest of the petal. And that way, that's one way of getting some darks and lights in the same area. And don't forget, if your initial coat goes, base coat goes on too light, you can apply second coat, third coat, as long as you're letting each coat of paint dry. And we'll do this one as well. So we'll do that same, but this time we want the darker tone to go right up against where the top of the flower ends. So let's go in there. I'm not doing a straight line, I'm just dotting in so the two sort of blend together. A shadowed area coming down here, so we need to add more pigment because we want a darker tone. Again, we'll create a little bit of striping along there where there might be dips in the petal itself. So let's pull that down there as well. And this time we're just going to add another colour. We're going to add a tiny bit of orange into here and pull that pigment down this area. Transfer some of that orange over onto the magenta, and we're letting the colours blend together now, but we're still keeping the majority of the pigment at the top where we want shadowed areas to be. Again, cleaning the brush off. So it's still damp. I'm not drying the brush. I'm just taking some of the water out of the belly of the brush. And then we're going to go into the edges of the pigment. And we're just going to sweep it down. It softens those edges and gives us a look of highlights and shadows in the petal. And while we're doing this, the other areas are drying. So we can go back to the petals that are in between those in a minute. If you've done a petal like this and you're thinking it looks too light already and it's not even dry, because we know it's going to dry lighter, pick up a little bit of pigment, tiny bit, so more pigment, less water, drop it in, let it do its thing. Now this area is now dry, so I can pick up a little bit of pigment too, and we can just put a little bit of stippling, so that's just tapping the end of your brush onto the paper, applying some pigment, and in those little areas it will just dry that little bit darker for you. Don't do any lines or horizontal or vertical lines in this area. Just keep it nice and simple, little dabbing motion, and just let the paint do its thing. Might take the shadow area up slightly into the flower. You don't have to if you don't want to. You're painting your world. As long as you're relaxing and enjoying the process, that is all that matters. Now if I bring a darker pigment down here, it will bleed into the petal because that petal is still damp. Nice and gradually building up the colour, maybe a little bit more down there. Don't press down with your brush because we don't want to be lifting any pigment that we've already put down. If you dry your brush and then put it on the paint and lift, it will lift the paint off because it's osmosis, isn't it? Where paint, where water, moisture will move from a wet area to a dry area if given the chance, because it wants to form an equilibrium, a balance. That's why if we get dry tissue and put it in water, the tissue will soak it up because the water wants to move to where there's a dryness. So we're going to leave that one as it is for now. We can darken it later if we want to by putting glazes over, but let's just hit this area with the hairdryer again, and then we can get some other petals put in, and we can also do some more work on the butterfly. That should be dry enough. So let's do some more light petals. So working the same as we have on that one. I'll work this one first, I think. Completely up to you. So working all the petals in the same way. This one's got quite a bit of shadowing down this area, I've noticed. And then clean water and bring it to that edge, softening the edge. Maybe have a little bit more shadow, so more pigment, less water to this area. So now we don't want to do that one and we don't want to do that one because that petal is wet. So we'll come down to this one. So I'm going to mix a little bit of purple in with this mixture because we've got a little bit of a shadow underneath here. And this shadow is being produced by the petal that's laying on top. So a little bit of shadow there and under that one as well. Now we're going to add a little bit of warmth to this petal as well. Now you can let, if you wanted to, you could let that create a hard edge. If you want hard edged shadows, you could leave that to dry. I'm going to get a little bit of orange now, mix it with a little bit of the magenta, and it just alters the colour ever so slightly for added interest. And we'll bring that down the rest of the petal. And we've given that chance to settle a little bit. And now we'll let the two meet. And once that petal is dry, we can always add another shadow over there if we feel that one's drying too light. Because if we add any more pigment to it now to darken the shadow, it'll bleed back down into the rest of the petal. So we'll do this one as well. So the same, and we've just worked it, a little bit of purple in there, in with the magenta. Let's go right up underneath there. Down that area as well. So shadow, shadow, let it rest a little bit, pick up some orange, pop it on here. And then we can let the two meet. Pushing the pigment around to where I want it. So not adding any more pigment, just moving the pigment up towards the shadow. Going to give it a quick dry again now. And we'll just do this one. So this is a darker one, so let's pick up a little bit more pigment, take it that little bit more intense, a little bit darker. And there's some orange mixing in there as well, that's fine. And lean my head on one side so I don't get in the way while we get this little bit of shadow in there between the two petals. And drag it down. Picking up a little bit of the orange, mixing it with what we've just been using and adding that to the bottom part of the painting, of the petal. And then letting the two mix. So just pushing the pigment up there. tidying up those edges slightly, and leave that one to dry. Okay. If you want to increase the vibrancy on any of these, then you can go in with second coats or third coats, because the more pigment you add, the more vibrant it's going to dry. Let's go in with, which one shall we do? The one on the left. So again, working from the darkest part of the petal. Careful not to touch this area because it may still be wet. We've only just applied that pigment there. Up from the top, give it a little tap. And then we may have some darks coming down. Don't go right to the edge because we want it lighter across there where the light's hitting it. Now you could leave it like that. You could just do a more abstract, stylized kind of flower where the lights are the white of the paper, which is what a lot of traditional watercolour artists do. Adding just a little bit of colour. There's a bit of a hard edge there, so I'll go over that a couple of times, and because it's not completely dry, it'll fade away. Okay. And because this one's so close, I think we'll pop this one in as well. So don't forget, if you're doing one next to one you've already done, some of the colour might come across, but that's fine on this one. So dark up towards where the flower top is, where it's casting a shadow. A little bit of shadow down this edge maybe. Add a little bit more water to that. Maybe a little bit of orange in there as well. Some of the petal lines in there. In with a bit more of the orange, I think, to warm things up a bit. And then break that up slightly. So the lines will still be there because we went wet on dry, but they won't be so harsh because we've gone over them straight away. And you can soften them just by rubbing the brush very gently on them if they're too stark. Obviously, if you add pigment like this, the paper's damp and it will spread of its own accord to anywhere you put it where the paper is wet. Okay, let's leave this area of the flower now to completely dry. We'll go back up to the butterfly. So while we're using the round brush, I'm going to pick up some paint grey, because that's what we were working on for the butterfly. Like that. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to switch to, oh, in actual fact, let's get some a different orange in there actually. So we're going to be using orange. So it's just called orange on this one. Making sure it's in my camera view, and some deep cadmium, so that's the yellow, there's this one. We're going to mix those two together and we're going to slightly alter the coloration on the butterfly wings. So you could have done this before, but I just like to get that undertone across the whole wing to begin with. Turning the paper around again so we're not reaching over what we've just painted. And now applying this colour just to the orange areas that are showing through, and checking that your paper's dry. If that felt cold, it means that the paper's still wet. I would need to dry it off, but it feels normal temperature. So we can go on and just add this colour to these areas. And because we're applying it over this orange, that orange is still going to show through because we're using transparent colours. It just gives a little bit more interest to the painting. So the top half of the wing, we're just going to add a few bits, and you can leave lines now. You don't have to cover the whole thing. So just very, very gently do maybe the bottom portion just to add a little bit of interest of each of the orange areas. And for the bottom half, I'm going to add a little bit more yellow. So we're just altering it very, very slightly. So it just adds a little bit more of a dimension if we alter the colours slightly. And here, same again, don't lean on what you've just done. And I'll try not to get in the way of the camera. And again, just add in a little bit. If it goes over the black, that's fine. We're going to, over the Payne's grey area, we're going to be going over that again anyway, just to darken certain areas up. So now we're just leaving some areas without this new colour on and some areas with colour on. Going into where there's more orange. And we're just altering it very slightly as we go. If you wanted to do just solid blocks of colour in these areas, then feel free to just miss this little part. But I do find it just adds to the interest of the piece. And to get a better look, don't forget to whiz your paper back round to the right way round and see if you can make any alterations while you've got this colour mixed up. Just taking the yellow, leaning over the petals because they're still wet, and just adding it to the top there, just for a little bit more interest. This area is still wet, so it'll bleed in. You're still working wet in wet on these areas because they're still damp. And just softening those lines very slightly. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to add a little bit more orange to this mix, so I'm taking it more orange than anything now. And that little bit of a stronger pigment, I'm just going to make a couple of shadow lines. One there, one there. Going towards the butterfly, getting thinner as they go towards the butterfly itself. One there. Maybe one there. And we're going to leave that to dry. Okay. Now we'll get a little base coat on the stem. So just this, I'm going to leave these because these are going to be worked exactly the same as we worked these. And this is already quite a long video for you all. So we're going into bottle green. Now you might think, oh Kerry, there's no colour like that on the painting. And the reason being is we're going to mix it with some of the yellow. So that is a very dark green, almost like a racing green. But all we're going to do is take some of the yellow and mix the two together. A little bit more yellow and mix. Yeah, so it gives like an olive green. Now you can either do the stem wet on wet or wet on dry, it's entirely up to you. But make sure that the petal just there is dry, because if that's not dry, this green will run into that petal, okay? Now we want the stem to be darker at the top, where there's a shadow formed by the petals, and then lighter as we go. So you can just apply a little bit of green, come out, clean your brush. Now all I've got is water on there now. And I'm just dipping it in and just picking some of that pigment out. And now into the yellow. Let's just go up in that corner. And we're just adding a hint of yellow to the stem. And then dragging it down, and we're going to use the technique of dry brushing now. We're just going to let our brush run out of pigment and water, just so that it fades away onto the paper. Because the stem isn't the main man of the painting, it's the butterfly. So you don't want to be fiddling with the stem too much, she says, going into the stem again. Just go up there, just take the stem up between those petals, add a little bit more pigment there, let it run up, and then we'll leave that to dry. Like that. Now I'm going to dry everything with the hairdryer, and we'll just get some detailing put onto the butterfly, and then we'll see how the whole thing looks. You can go back and do more to the petals, glazing up more colours like we did here to darken areas. You can add different colours to areas. Try it on a swatch of paper like this first. If you've got two colours mixed together, pop them on here, let them dry. If you want to add another colour on top, try it on a swatch of paper before you go on to your main project, because I wouldn't want you to get so far and then make a mistake on your main project. Okay, hairdryer again. Okay, back to the rigger brush. This is when you want nerves of steel. Now we're just going to get the little antennae painted in. So you want quite a dry brush, a little bit of pigment, and I'm hoping I'm not going to get my head in the way now. And we're just going to one stroke for each. 1, 2. Leave it at that and turn the board round. You don't have to, but I'm going to. And we're just going to put some veining marks in. So I'm just getting the original painting over, excuse me, so I can actually see where I put the original veining marks. And we're going to add those now. So with the rigger brush, or with a nice fine brush if you have one. If not, you could use a water resistant pen of black ink or dark, dark colour ink. and just put some of those veining lines in. They don't have to be perfect, as long as there's something there to give a little bit of interest. So just going around these areas. A little bit of interest, something to look at. And obviously you can go over these again if you've not gone dark enough when this is all dry. And obviously I'm assuming you're going to take a lot longer than I have over this piece today. So you can really take your time and make each mark count. So now we want some spots, don't we? Let me just show you the original. So these lovely white spots. So what we need to do, make sure the brush is clean and start picking up some white, which I didn't put in my little section of 6, did I? So let's just pick up some white, making sure you can still see that on screen. And there's no point really in me transferring it to a well, because we're just going to be using this white straight out of the pan, and it does dry whiter than it goes on when it's wet. So let me show you. And you may need to do more than one layer for it to go as white as it is on here. I think I used maybe 4 layers to get it nice and opaque. So don't lose heart. If your first layer looks too translucent, just keep layering up. Okay, and that does. Just get a little bit more water on there so we can mix up more pigment. So people use, if you can use a gel pen, a white gel pen, a little bit of white gouache. If you don't want to be going backwards and forwards, putting lots and lots of layers of this white on. But I do advise you to give it a go, because it's quite surprising. So 1 little drop. So I'm just tapping the white on. And then you're going to have to wait for it to dry to see how light it's actually gone. And just using the very tip of the brush. If this painting you're doing is in a sketchbook, you could actually use anything. You could even use Tipp-Ex to get the white on. But this watercolour does work. You just have to be very patient and build the layers up very gradually. So I'm just going to mix up a little bit more. Let's use the liner brush to see if we can get some really small marks on there. So picking up a lot of pigment. That one's spread out, so that's got to go in again. And I'll just do the one area and we'll dry it off, and you'll see how many layers you actually need to put on to do the whole butterfly. And obviously make sure you're using clean water as well, else it will just discolour the white paint. Let's dry that. Okay, I'm just looking, I think I might have discoloured that pan slightly, so let's see if this one works a little better for us today. So if I've not cleaned my palette off properly after I've been using it, that could have been the case. It has dried whiter, but I know it can go whiter than that, so let's get a bit more. That's better. And it's just a case of you're just going to have to keep adding more and then drying it, adding more and letting it dry. And it's just be patient and just build it up very, very steadily until you've got the desired result. And it does take a while. And once it's dry, once you've added numerous layers to this, it will dry to this. And you'll end up with a butterfly. Oh, let's put his legs in, he's got no legs. So when you're applying the legs, again, just the same as the antennae, use a nice thin brush and try and do them in one go. Yeah, apply the legs before you apply the spots. You've got one leg there, one leg going down there, one leg coming down there at the back, another one coming down here, and his proboscis going into the flower as well, like that. Once you have all your white dots on, you can add white dots to the top of the flower as well, white dots to the edges of the flowers. If there's anywhere that you need to lighten, go over that area with a damp brush, lift with a tissue, lift the pigment off with a tissue. Keep building up layers by glazing one colour over a dried colour, and until you have the desired result you want. So I'll put the other camera on now and bid you farewell, dear people. So let's have a look, see if we can do this without making a mess. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed today's quick run through with the beautiful Derwent pan watercolours and the Technique brushes. And if you're interested, the water brushes, I was using this little water brush, but they also do a set of 4 water brushes with different size brushes. Let me just show you those quickly before we say au revoir. So there's also these style of brushes, so 3 different size rounds and a flat. If you're interested in water brushes, they've got a push button, work really well. But whatever materials you have, whatever watercolours and brushes you have, the main thing is enjoy yourself, have a great time painting, and thank you for joining me today. Take care everybody and stay creative. Bye bye.